He didn't need a calendar to remember Sunday. Hey. His heart reminded him every week. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you love meaningful stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I really enjoy seeing where these stories travel. Frank moved slower than he used to, but Sunday mornings never changed. At exactly 8:45 a.m., he arrived at the quiet cemetery just outside town. His steps were steady, his routine memorized. In his left hand, a small bouquet of yellow roses. In his right, a thermos of black coffee. No sugar, no milk. Margaret used to tease him for it, said it matched his stubborn streak. He walked the same path each week, through the rows of headstones, until he reached the one that mattered most. It sat beneath an old elm tree, where the shade shifted gently with the seasons. The grave was simple and lovingly kept. He knelt, slowly and carefully, and brushed away a few fallen leaves from the stone. Then he placed the flowers at its base, upright, thorns trimmed, just like she liked them. The inscription read, Margaret Lillian Hayes, born 1949, passed 2019. Forever in bloom. Frank didn't need to read it. He'd memorized every word years ago, but somehow saying it in his mind gave him comfort, like she could hear it. Morning, love, he said softly, settling down on the bench beside her resting place. It's getting cold again. That wind nearly took my hat off today. He chuckled to himself and sipped from the thermos. Sometimes he brought stories. Sometimes he just sat in silence. Either way, it helped. Talking to Margaret, even through the quiet, made the days feel less empty. Before leaving, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded letter. He always wrote one before each visit, not long, just a few lines about his week. What the cat knocked over, what he made for dinner, what he wished she could still see. He read it aloud, softly, then tucked it back inside his journal and stood with a sigh. His knees weren't what they used to be, but the promise was always worth it. Same time next week, he whispered. He always kept his promises, but the following Sunday, something changed. He followed the same path, same coffee, same flowers. But as he approached the headstone, something new caught his eye. A small, folded piece of paper was resting near the base of the stone. It was tucked carefully beneath one of last week's roses, as if placed there with intention. Frank froze. In 4 years of visits, nothing like this had ever happened. He looked around. The cemetery was empty, not a sound, but the breeze in the trees. He bent down slowly and picked up the note. It was thick, good-quality paper. His name was written on the front, in delicate, unfamiliar handwriting. He opened it with cautious fingers. Inside was just one sentence. She spoke of you often. I've wanted to say thank you. Frank stared at the words. His breath caught in his throat. Someone had known her, and they'd written to him. He sat down heavily on the bench, the letter still in his hand. For the first time in years, his Sunday didn't feel like something he did alone. It felt like the beginning of something he couldn't yet explain. Frank didn't mention the note to anyone that week. Not to the cashier at the corner store, not to his neighbor Doris, who liked to ask about his Sundays, and not even to his daughter, who called every other Wednesday with updates about the grandkids. He kept it tucked inside the back of his journal, between 2 letters he'd written months ago. But it stayed on his mind like a song he couldn't stop humming. She spoke of you often. Those 5 words stayed with him the most. The idea that Margaret had talked to someone, about him no less, after all those quiet visits, after all that time in the hospital, it stirred something deep in him, something hopeful and something afraid. That week, Frank kept to his usual rhythm. He fed the cat, watered the ferns, watched his favorite shows, though he mostly just stared at the screen. Everything moved as it always did, but Sunday came heavier than usual. He rose early, dressed in his usual navy sweater, the one Margaret had always said brought out his eyes, and made his way back to the cemetery. No note this time. No sign of anyone. Just the trees swaying gently overhead and the gravel crunching beneath his slow steps. He placed the flowers down with the same care, then sat on the bench beside her and took a long sip of coffee before speaking. "I got a message last week," he said, not quite looking at the headstone. "Someone left it here. Said you talked about me." His voice cracked a little, but he kept going. "I don't know who they are. Don't even know if they meant to be found. But I liked it. Hearing that, like you were still here in some way I didn't know." He reached into his coat pocket and unfolded his weekly letter, the one he had written just like all the others. But instead of reading it aloud like he always did, he paused. Then, slowly, he reached back into his journal and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. He started to write, "To the one who left the note, I don't know who you are or how you knew my wife, but I'm grateful you wrote to me. It meant more than I can explain. If you're ever here again, I'll leave this letter for you under the rose. Same spot. You don't have to reply. I just wanted to say thank you. Frank." He folded it neatly, just like the note he'd found, and tucked it under the smooth stone at the base of Margaret's grave. Then he sat, waiting. Not for someone to arrive, but for the silence to feel less heavy again. When he left that morning, he turned around once more at the gate and looked back at the grave. The flowers, the stone, the folded letter tucked just beneath it. His routine hadn't changed, but something invisible inside it had. Frank didn't expect a response. He'd left his letter more out of instinct than hope, the same way he wrote to Margaret, because it felt right, not because he thought anyone else would ever read it. But still, something inside him stirred when Sunday crept closer. A kind of restless anticipation he hadn't felt in years. The morning was cooler than usual. A thin layer of frost glistened on the grass, and the air smelled faintly of chimney smoke. Frank wore his heavier coat, buttoned all the way up, and brought a scarf just in case. As he reached Margaret's grave, his eyes went immediately to the base of the stone. And there it was. Another note, neatly folded. Just like before, resting beneath the newest bouquet of yellow roses. No envelope this time, just a single sheet of cream-colored paper, folded twice and held in place with a small, round pebble. Frank's heart knocked in his chest. He looked around instinctively. Still no one. The cemetery was as still as ever, the same quiet breeze moving through the trees. He picked up the note and opened it with care. "Dear Frank, I hope it's okay that I wrote again. I wasn't sure if you'd find the first note or if it would feel like an intrusion. I met Margaret in her final weeks. I was just a volunteer at the time, young, nervous, trying to do something meaningful. I brought her flowers once, when no one else had come that day. She called me her ray of sunshine. But she talked about you, Frank, every time I visited. She told me about your Sunday picnics, your bad coffee, and how you always knew when she was pretending to be strong. I didn't know her long, but I remember her, and I remember how much she loved you. I've carried that with me. A friend." Frank read the letter twice, then a third time, his hands trembling not from the cold, but from the way each word opened something inside him, something that had been shut for years. He sat down on the bench, the letter still in his hands. He could see her, even now, Margaret, with that stubborn sparkle in her eyes, telling stories to a young stranger, probably downplaying the pain and making jokes like she always did. It sounded just like her. He folded the note carefully and placed it into his journal in the same pocket where he kept her letters. Then he reached into his coat, pulled out a pen and paper, and began to write. "Thank you for telling me. I never knew she had someone near her in those last weeks. I always feared she was alone when I couldn't be there. It brings me peace to know she had light, you, when I couldn't bring it myself. If you ever feel like sharing more, I'll be here. Same place, same time." He left the letter in the same spot, under the smooth stone, beside the fresh flowers. As he stood to leave, Frank looked around the cemetery again. Still empty, but it no longer felt silent. Somewhere, someone out there carried a memory of Margaret. And now they were carrying part of Frank's grief, too. He wasn't sure who they were. Not yet. But for the first time in a long while, he felt less like a man talking to a headstone, and more like a part of something still unfolding. Frank began thinking about the hospital more than he had in years. The gray hallways, the way Margaret's laughter always softened the beeping of machines, the nurse who brought her ginger tea, and now, this letter. A letter from someone who had been there when he wasn't. A stranger who knew her voice, her stories, her love for bad jokes and worse coffee. All week, Frank's mind drifted backward. He walked through his days like a man following a thread, tugging gently on a memory he hadn't dared unravel until now. He remembered the last month of Margaret's life more clearly than he wished he did. There had been so much fear, so many sleepless nights, but also moments, small, unexpected ones, that stayed with him. The day she asked him to sing their song under his breath, even though his voice cracked on the high notes. The nurse who cried quietly outside her room after a long shift. The time he'd brought her a yellow scarf to match the daffodils blooming outside, and she'd insisted it made her look like spring dressed up for a party. He hadn't remembered a young volunteer, not directly, but now that he thought of it, there had been a girl, quiet, polite, always carrying a book. She wasn't on staff, just someone passing through, helping where she could. Margaret had mentioned her once, hadn't she? "Sweet girl," she'd said. "Reminds me of myself at that age, a little shy, a lot of heart." Frank didn't think much of it back then. His focus had been Margaret, every breath, every hour they had left. But now that memory felt like a missing puzzle piece falling into place. And the fact that this young woman, whoever she was, still remembered Margaret, still carried those few conversations in her heart. Years later, it meant more than Frank could explain. So the next Sunday he brought 2 letters, one for Margaret, as always, and one for the girl. "You said she called you her ray of sunshine. I believe it. I've been writing to her every week since she passed, but this is the first time someone's written back. Someone who knew her voice, not just her name. If you're willing, would you tell me more? What did she say when I wasn't there? What did you see that I didn't? Thank you again for being there and for remembering." He folded it carefully and placed it beneath the same smooth stone. Then he sat, not just in memory, but in something closer to conversation. He looked out over the quiet rows of headstones, the wind ruffling his coat collar. His coffee had gone cold, but he didn't mind. For the first time, he wasn't just remembering Margaret as she had been. He was beginning to see her through someone else's eyes, a stranger's eyes, but not for much longer. The letter was waiting the next week, neatly folded, just like before, resting beneath the roses and stone where Frank always left his. It had no envelope, no signature, just familiar handwriting and words that felt like pages torn from the past. Dear Frank. She never talked about dying, not once. I used to worry I wouldn't know what to say to someone near the end, but Margaret made it easy. She asked me questions about school, about my parents. She teased me for always carrying a book I never seemed to finish. She told me you were the best man she'd ever known, that you whistled when you were nervous, that you once tried to build her a porch swing and ended up nailing your glove to the beam. I don't know if you remember the day it rained. Hard, all afternoon, but she made me sit beside her and listen to it on the window. She said, "This is what love sounds like. Steady, even when the sky is falling." I've never forgotten that. Frank read the letter 3 times before folding it slowly and sliding it into his journal. His throat felt tight. The wind brushed the edges of the note before he tucked it away. Like it, too, wanted to hold on just a little longer. The porch swing story had been over 30 years ago. Margaret had laughed for a week after it happened. He remembered her chasing him through the yard with the glove still nailed to the beam, waving it like a flag of surrender. And she remembered it. Told someone else. That thought undid him in the quietest way. The weeks passed, and the letters continued. They didn't use names, not once. But the bond between them deepened like roots growing underground, unseen but steady. They shared memories of Margaret, stories from both ends of her life, from their home and from the hospital bed, from marriage to medicine to mourning. Frank told her about the way Margaret hummed when she cooked, about the love notes she used to hide in his lunchbox, about how she once stayed up all night patching his favorite sweater because some things are worth fixing, even when they're old. And the girl, whoever she was, told him about small moments Frank never could have witnessed, like the time Margaret helped calm a frightened patient in the room next door by reading poetry through the wall, or how she once gave her last pudding cup to a nurse who hadn't eaten all day. Frank learned more about his wife in those quiet weeks than he had in years. He wasn't grieving her alone anymore. One Sunday, as he folded his reply, he paused before sealing the paper under the stone. Then, carefully, he wrote one more line. "If you ever wanted to visit together, I wouldn't mind the company." He didn't know if she'd say yes. He didn't even know if she still lived nearby. But something told him that after all these letters, it was time to let the words become something more, because grief had brought them together. But Margaret's love, that was building something new. The reply didn't come the next Sunday, or the one after that. Frank tried not to take it personally. Maybe she was away. Maybe life had pulled her in another direction. Or maybe the idea of meeting face to face felt too real, too close to something neither of them was ready for. Still, when he arrived each week, he looked. His routine hadn't changed, but his anticipation had. He caught himself scanning the cemetery a little longer, listening more carefully to footsteps in the distance, watching the gate as he poured his coffee. Nothing. Until the 3rd week. That morning, the letter was there again, folded, precise, resting beneath the smooth stone that had become their mailbox. Frank reached for it carefully, like opening something sacred. "Dear Frank, I read your note 3 times. I wasn't sure how to answer. Not because I don't want to meet you, but because I'm not sure how I'll feel when I do. I've carried Margaret's memory with me like something borrowed and precious. You've been her forever. I was only there for the ending, but you've given me more of her than I ever expected to know. You've made her real again, not just a patient with kind eyes, but a whole life. If you're still open to it, maybe next Sunday? I'll come by at 9. If I see you, I'll introduce myself. If not, no hard feelings. Either way, thank you for all of this. A friend." Frank sat down hard on the bench. His hands shook as he folded the letter again, holding it against his chest for a moment before tucking it away. He stared out over the headstones, heart thudding like a man preparing for something far more serious than coffee and conversation. She was coming. Maybe. It wasn't a promise, but it was an open door. And that was more than he'd dared hope for just weeks ago. He spent the next few days thinking about it, about what he'd say, what he wouldn't. He picked out a nicer sweater, cleaned the bench beside Margaret's grave with a cloth, even though it wasn't dirty. He brought fresh flowers early, checking the stems twice. On Saturday night, he barely slept, and when Sunday came, he arrived a full hour early. He brought 2 cups of coffee, one black, one with cream and sugar, just in case. At 8:59, he stood by the grave, staring toward the cemetery gate, and waited. He didn't know if she'd come, or who exactly she was, whether she'd be shy or smiling or unsure, but he knew one thing for certain. This Sunday would not be like the others. At exactly 9 a.m., the gate creaked open. Frank didn't turn right away. His hands were wrapped tightly around both coffee cups, and his breath was shallow, not from exertion, but from something that felt like standing on the edge of a memory made real. He heard footsteps, soft, uncertain ones, moving along the gravel path. Then a pause. "Frank?" He turned. A woman stood a few feet away, late 30s, maybe early 40s, shoulder-length dark hair, a navy blue coat, no makeup, no umbrella, just a single daisy in her hand. Her voice was gentle, but steady, like someone who had practiced saying just one word out loud. He nodded. "Yes." She offered a small smile. "I wasn't sure if I'd come, and then I wasn't sure if I should say anything." "I'm glad you did," Frank said softly. She approached slowly, glancing once at the headstone before meeting his eyes again. "I'm Anna." Frank repeated the name in his mind. Anna. He hadn't known what to expect. No image, no voice, just a series of letters on paper. But now, standing in front of him, she didn't feel like a stranger. "I brought you coffee," he said, holding out the second cup. "Wasn't sure how you take it." She accepted it with both hands, eyes surprised. "Cream and sugar. You guessed right." He chuckled. Margaret would have called that fate. They sat together on the bench, not too close, not too far. The space between them wasn't awkward. It was respectful, reverent, almost. For a while they didn't say much, just sipped their coffee, watched the wind move through the trees, let the silence carry the weight of all that had come before. "I didn't expect you to write back," Anna said eventually. "I left that first note because I couldn't stop thinking about her. I thought maybe you'd never even see it." "I almost didn't," Frank admitted. "I wasn't looking for anything new, but you gave me something I didn't know I needed." She nodded slowly. "She gave me that too." They talked then, quietly, gently, about Margaret, about her laugh, her stories, her stubborn optimism. Anna shared details Frank had never heard. Frank, in turn, gave her parts of Margaret's life Anna could never have known. It was like piecing together a puzzle neither of them realized was incomplete. At one point, Anna reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something folded, a photograph. Margaret, in the hospital bed holding a daisy, smiling. Not in pain, not afraid, just smiling. "I took this the day she gave me my nickname," Anna said. "Ray of Sunshine." Frank stared at the image, his eyes wet. "She never let me take pictures in those last weeks. Said she didn't want me remembering her with wires in her nose. But this is beautiful." He looked at Anna, his voice shaking. "Thank you for being there, for letting her talk." Anna placed the daisy gently at the base of the headstone. "She talked because she felt safe," she said, "because she loved you, and she wanted to keep saying your name, even when you weren't there." They sat a while longer, no need to rush, and when Anna stood to leave, Frank did too. "Same time next week?" he asked, almost shyly. She smiled, warmer now. "I'd like that." And as she walked away, Frank turned back toward Margaret's stone. "You found me someone," he whispered. "Didn't you?" The wind answered like a soft yes in the trees above. Frank arrived early the next Sunday, just like before, but this time he brought 2 cushions for the bench. It was a small thing, something Margaret would have done without thinking. She always believed in preparing for comfort, even if you didn't know who would show up. Kindness starts with making space, she used to say. So Frank made space. Anna arrived at 9 a.m. sharp. She wore the same navy coat, but this time she carried a small paper bag with her. Inside was a single lemon poppy seed muffin, Margaret's favorite. They didn't talk about it, but Frank's eyes softened when he saw it. He understood. They sat on the bench, sipping coffee, like old friends who had known each other for years, even though they still didn't know each other's stories beyond Margaret. "I've been thinking about her a lot this week," Anna said. "I always do around this time of year. I didn't know her long, but she stayed with me." Frank nodded. "She had that way about her, got into your heart, and refused to leave." Anna smiled. "She once told me she wasn't afraid of dying, said she was afraid of being forgotten." Frank swallowed hard. "She won't be," he said. Anna reached into her bag and pulled out something carefully wrapped in brown paper. "I brought you this," she said. "I wasn't sure if I should, but it feels right." He unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a small notebook, bound in worn fabric. The first few pages were filled with neat, slanted handwriting. Margaret's voice, captured in ink. Anna explained, "She asked me to write some things down for her. Little stories, things she said when she was too tired to hold a pen. I kept them. I didn't know if they belonged to me or to you." Frank ran his fingers along the page. Frank always whistles when he's making eggs. I think it's because he forgets I can hear him through the hallway. I never tell him, though. I like the sound. If I go first, tell him I remembered the song he sang at our wedding. Every word. He will be okay. He doesn't believe that now, but he will be. Frank's hand trembled. He closed the notebook gently, holding it like something sacred. "She left this behind," Anna said, "and maybe she meant for both of us to carry it." They sat in silence for a long time. There were no more questions between them, only shared memory, shared grief, and the quiet knowledge that Margaret had, in her final weeks, planted something lasting in two different hearts. "I didn't get to say goodbye," Anna said softly. Frank placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You said something better. You showed up." The wind moved through the trees, soft and slow, and as they left that morning, together, Frank looked back at the stone and smiled. Margaret had always believed in leaving something behind that mattered, and she had. The seasons had started to change. Leaves, once sharp green, now turned golden and loose, dancing across the cemetery path as Frank walked, slow but steady, toward the same elm tree, the same bench, the same stone. But something was different now. He wasn't alone. Anna walked beside him, a scarf wrapped loosely around her neck, her steps quiet and familiar. In her hand, she carried the small notebook Margaret had dictated during her final weeks. It was dog-eared now, softly worn from being read and reread. They both carried it as if it were something alive. Margaret's grave greeted them like an old friend. Frank placed the yellow roses gently at the base, then took his seat on the bench. Anna joined him. No need to speak right away. Silence had become something shared between them, not avoided. A kind of reverence. He took a deep breath and looked out over the rows of stones. "You know," he said, "I used to think grief was something you had to carry alone, like a heavy coat that didn't fit anymore." Anna nodded, eyes fixed ahead. "But it turns out," he continued, "sometimes someone comes along and helps you wear it differently. Doesn't make it lighter exactly, just more bearable." She smiled gently. She would have liked that metaphor. They both laughed, quiet, real laughter, the kind that rises not from joy, but from connection. That morning, a young couple passed by with a toddler in tow. The little girl toddled ahead, curious, and stopped to look at the flowers by Margaret's grave. Her mother gently tugged her hand, offering Frank and Anna an apologetic smile. Frank just nodded and smiled back. "Let her look," he said. "It's a beautiful spot." After they were gone, Anna turned to him. "Do you think you'll ever stop coming here?" He thought about that. "No," he said, "but I think I come for different reasons now." She waited. "At first, I came to hold on. Then I came to let go. And now, I think I come to remember her in good company." Anna leaned back, her shoulders settling. They stayed for another hour, sipped lukewarm coffee, read a few pages from the notebook aloud, talked about nothing and everything. And when it was time to go, Frank stood slowly and looked down at the stone. "Born 1949, past 2019, he read softly. "But the rest of the story, it keeps going." Anna gently placed a fresh daisy at the base. They walked back down the path side by side. The breeze was light. The sky was clear. And on that Sunday, a day that once belonged to silence and sorrow, there was something new. Hope. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. Like love that refuses to leave. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, we'd love to have you as a subscriber.